Imagine a company so powerful it didn't just dominate trade. It commanded armies, collected taxes, imprisoned citizens, fought wars, toppled kings, and ruled over 200 million people. Not a government, not an empire, a company, with shareholders, a board of directors, and a balance sheet. For over 2.5 centuries, one single organization reshaped the fate of continents, redirected the flow of global wealth, and left an imprint on the world so deep that historians are still tracing its edges today. This is the story of the East India Company. And if you've never heard its full story, you're about to understand why some call it the most powerful commercial enterprise in human history. If you find yourself captivated by stories like this one, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It helps this channel bring more carefully researched history to life. It begins, as so many world-altering stories do, with spice. In the final years of the 16th century, the great powers of Europe were engaged in a furious, often violent competition for access to the riches of Asia. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. Commodities that sound ordinary today were, in the 1500s, worth more than gold by weight. They preserved food, flavored feasts, and signaled status. For centuries, these goods had flowed westward through Ottoman and Venetian middlemen, arriving in European markets at staggering markups. The Portuguese had cracked open a sea route to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope, and the Spanish were accumulating unimaginable wealth from the Americas. England, watching from the edges of this global scramble, understood that it needed a seat at the table, or it would be left behind entirely. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, giving birth to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The charter awarded the company a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope for 15 years. With relatively modest initial capital, a handful of ships, and enormous ambition, these merchants set sail into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, facing storms, disease, pirates, and the hostile fleets of the Dutch and Portuguese, who had no interest in sharing the wealth of Asia. The earliest voyages were punishing, ships rotted, crews died of scurvy and fever. Entire expeditions returned with little to show. But the potential profits were extraordinary, and investors kept coming. Slowly, painfully, the company established its first foothold on the Indian subcontinent. A trading post at Surat, on the western coast of India, in 1608. From there, the network expanded. Madras in 1639. Bombay, gifted to England as part of a royal dowry in 1661. Calcutta, founded at the close of the 17th century. Each settlement began as a modest warehouse on a shoreline, surrounded by the noise of merchants, translators, dock workers, and the mingled smells of salt water and exotic cargo. Cotton textiles from the Coromandel coast, indigo from Gujarat, silk from Bengal, saltpeter for gunpowder, and eventually, tea, a commodity that would come to define the company's fortunes and transform English culture entirely. For decades, the company operated as merchants were expected to operate, buying, selling, negotiating, building relationships with the Mughal emperors and regional rulers who controlled access to India's extraordinary wealth. But trade in the early modern world was never entirely peaceful. Rival European powers constantly threatened company interests. Local politics were complex and volatile. And so, the company did what seemed practical at the time. It began to arm itself. The shift from merchant house to military power was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Fortifications were built around trading posts. Private soldiers were hired. Alliances were struck with Indian rulers against mutual enemies. But there is a moment when the transformation becomes impossible to ignore, and that moment belongs to a young military officer named Robert Clive. By the mid-18th century, the Mughal Empire, which had once been the mightiest power on the subcontinent, was fracturing. Regional governors were asserting independence. The French, through their own East India Company, were actively competing for influence, backing rival Indian rulers and threatening to push the English out entirely. Into this volatile landscape stepped Clive, a man whose audacity bordered on recklessness, but whose military instincts proved devastatingly effective. In June 1757, at a mango grove beside the river at Plassey, Company forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, in a battle that lasted barely a day. The victory was as much a product of political maneuvering and betrayal as military force. But its consequences were seismic. What would you consider the most extraordinary turning point in this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Reading them is one of the best parts of making these documentaries. Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on Earth, fell under company control. Clive was appointed governor. The company now had the right to collect taxes from millions of people, a power belonging to sovereigns, not merchants. Revenue poured in, territory expanded. And with each passing decade, the line between commercial enterprise and imperial government grew thinner until it effectively disappeared. The company now governed vast populations, maintained a private army that at its peak numbered over 200,000 soldiers, and administered courts, roads, and civil services across the subcontinent. Back in London, its shareholders grew rich, but the human cost in India was severe. Company taxation policies and trade monopolies disrupted local economies. The Bengal famine of 1770, in which millions perished, unfolded under company administration, an event that historians continue to examine and debate in terms of responsibility and cause, but which cast a long, dark shadow over the company's record. By 1857, decades of accumulated grievances over taxation, land seizure, cultural interference, and military conditions erupted in the Indian Rebellion, the most significant armed uprising against company rule. It engulfed vast regions of northern India and shook the British establishment to its core. The rebellion was suppressed with tremendous violence on both sides, but it shattered any remaining pretense that a private company could justly govern a subcontinent. The following year, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct control of India. An organization that had begun with a handful of ships and a royal signature had, over 2.5 centuries, transformed the world. Redrawn maps, redirected rivers of global wealth, and left a legacy still examined, debated, and felt across continents. A company. That became an empire, and then vanished into history. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe to this channel. New documentaries, researched to the same standard, are released regularly, and the next one may be the most remarkable yet.